She waited at the train station every day. Then one day, he showed up. She sat on the same wooden bench at the far end of the train platform, every single afternoon at exactly 4:15, her hands wrapped tightly around a small leather notebook. From a distance, she looked like any other commuter, calm, quiet, waiting for her train. But the truth was, she never boarded. She never even stood when the train arrived. She just sat there, watching it come and go, as if she were waiting for someone the rest of the world had forgotten. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Most people at the station barely noticed her at first. She blended in with the crowd, her dark hair tucked into a neat braid, her coat buttoned all the way up, her expression unreadable. But as weeks turned into months, those who passed through regularly began to recognize her. There she was again, always in the same spot, always with that same faraway look in her eyes. On this particular Tuesday, the air was cold and sharp, the kind of winter chill that makes people rush to get home. The loudspeaker crackled with an announcement about the approaching 4:20 train. Commuters shuffled their feet, checking their watches, balancing their coffee cups, tapping at their phones. Emily, though most people didn't yet know her name, opened her notebook and began to write. Her handwriting was small and deliberate, as though every word she put on the page mattered. She paused often, her gaze drifting toward the empty tracks, then back down to the paper. Across from her, a man in a gray scarf watched her for a moment. He had seen her here before, but today something about her stillness caught his attention. The train screeched into the station, brakes whining, doors sliding open. The crowd moved forward, flowing around her like a stream parting around a stone. She didn't budge. The man hesitated, wondering what could possibly keep someone in place like that. Then, shaking his head, he stepped onto the train, the doors closing behind him. The platform emptied. The sound of the train faded into the distance. Emily closed her notebook and rested it in her lap. Her eyes followed the horizon long after the tracks were quiet again. She took a deep breath, stood, and left without speaking to anyone. At the ticket booth, an older attendant leaned on the counter, his eyes following her retreating figure. "She was here again?" another employee asked, joining him. "Every day," the older man said. "Never gets on, never buys a ticket, just waits." "What's she waiting for?" He shrugged. "If I knew, I'd tell you. Some people carry a story they don't feel like sharing." The truth was, Emily's story began years ago, long before most of these commuters had ever stepped foot in this station. But she never offered explanations. She never hinted at her reasons. To anyone watching, she was simply the girl on the bench, the one who treated each afternoon like an appointment she couldn't miss. On her way home, Emily kept her notebook close. The streets were crowded, but she moved through them with purpose. She didn't stop for coffee or window shop or greet the people she passed. Her mind was somewhere else. Years back, on a summer day when the station was warmer, the air smelled like cut grass, and a boy with dark eyes had made a promise she still remembered. At her small apartment, she placed the notebook gently on her desk. The pages were filled with train sketches, each one dated, each one marking another day she had waited. She ran her fingers over the worn cover, then closed it, her eyes flicking to the clock. Tomorrow at 4:15, she would be there again. And the next day, and the next. No one knew it yet, but Emily was not simply passing time. She was counting the days until something, or someone, returned. By the second month, everyone who passed through the station at 4:15 knew who she was. They didn't know her name, where she lived, or why she came, but they knew her face. Some called her the waiting girl, others the quiet one, and a few simply referred to her as her, as if she were part of the station itself. It wasn't just the bench she always claimed. It was the way she claimed it. She would sit in the exact same spot, her coat buttoned all the way up, her small leather notebook resting on her lap. She would look down and write slowly, her pen moving across the page in steady lines. And then, as the train approached, she would pause, lift her head, and watch. She never waved, never stood, never smiled. The train would arrive, the crowd would board, the whistle would blow, and she would still be there, eyes fixed on the doors, until they slid shut again. The whispers began quietly. The man who sold coffee at the corner kiosk was one of the first to mention it. "I think she's waiting for someone," he told the ticket attendant one morning, pouring sugar into a paper cup. The attendant shrugged. "Aren't we all?" By the third week, a group of regular commuters had started making up stories. One said she was waiting for a soldier returning from overseas. Another guessed she had lost someone in an accident and came back every day hoping for a miracle. One woman was convinced she was an undercover reporter working on a big story. No one's version matched, but they all agreed on one thing. There was something unshakably sad about her. Even when she looked calm, there was a weight in her eyes, as though she was carrying something too heavy for anyone else to understand. One late afternoon, while she was scribbling in her notebook, a man named Peter, who took the 4:20 every weekday, stopped in front of her bench. "Miss," he said, "are you okay? You're here every day. Just making sure nothing's wrong." Emily looked up slowly, surprised that someone had addressed her directly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice even. Peter hesitated. "Do you need help finding someone?" She shook her head. "No." Her answer was polite but final. Peter gave her a small nod and walked away, but the encounter only added to the growing curiosity among the regulars. They started paying closer attention. They noted the way she always arrived a few minutes before the 4:15 announcement, how she sometimes flipped back through her notebook as if rereading old thoughts, how she never checked her phone. The station staff talked about her in the break room. "It's strange," one of the younger employees said. "She doesn't look lost. She looks certain, like she knows exactly what she's waiting for." "Or who," another added. That week, the weather turned cold again. The wind blew sharp between the tracks, scattering leaves and scraps of paper along the platform. Most people kept their heads down, hurrying to the warmth of the train cars. Emily sat as always, unmoving, a thin strand of hair escaping her braid and brushing against her cheek. On Friday, an older woman named Mrs. Callahan took the seat beside her. She had been riding the 4:20 for over 20 years and had never seen someone so consistent in their waiting. "Dear," she said, "you're going to freeze out here if you keep this up." Emily smiled faintly. "I'll be fine." Mrs. Callahan studied her for a moment. "Some promises," she said quietly, "take longer to keep than others. I hope yours is worth it." Emily didn't answer. She wasn't sure if she could explain it to someone who hadn't been there that day, years ago, when a stranger had looked her in the eyes and said, "I'll come back for you." The 4:20 pulled in, its headlights cutting through the gray evening. The crowd surged forward. Mrs. Callahan stood, gave Emily's shoulder a gentle pat, and joined the others. The doors closed, and Emily was alone again. When the sound of the train faded, she picked up her notebook, opened to a fresh page, and drew another small sketch of the train. Another day marked. Another day closer. The first time she saw him, the summer light made the steel rails look like silver threads. She was 17 and early for a train that was already late. The loudspeaker kept repeating the same apology in a tired voice. People shifted and sighed. A boy about her age stood near the timetable board, hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed like he was trying to read the future from the schedule. He glanced at her notebook and then away. When the second apology came, he laughed under his breath as if the station itself had told a small joke. He stepped closer. He said, "Is it any good?" She thought he meant the book and turned the cover so he could see it. He said, "No, I mean the waiting. Is it any good?" She smiled despite herself. She said, "It depends on the train." He said, "It depends on the person." His voice had a steady calm to it, like he did not mind empty minutes. She told herself not to talk to strangers. Then he said, "I am Daniel," and somehow that made it easier. He asked her name. She said, "Emily." He repeated it once, as if to set it in his memory. A breeze carried the smell of cut grass from the park beyond the fence. Somewhere far down the tracks, a signal clicked from red to yellow. They started with simple things. He said he had missed his earlier train because his little brother could not find his shoes. She said she had arrived early on purpose because she liked the quiet before the rush. He said he had never noticed any quiet in a station before. She said it was there if you listened between the announcements. He tilted his head like he was trying to hear it. For a minute they both fell silent and watched a sparrow hop along the edge of the platform. The delay stretched. He told her he wanted to study engineering, but he did not know where. She said she wanted to write, but did not know how people made a life out of stories. He said, "Maybe the story is the life." She said, "Maybe the life is the story." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that felt like an answer, even if it was not one. He asked about the notebook. She said it was nothing important, only thoughts she did not want to lose. He asked if she ever wrote about people she met. She said, "Only if I will see them again." He said, "Then I hope you write about me." She lifted her pen, pretended to write his name, and then closed the notebook as if to keep him inside it a little longer. A freight train thundered by without stopping, dragging heat and dust in its wake. When it passed, the world felt quiet again. Daniel pointed toward the far end of the tracks. He said, "When my brother and I were kids, we would put coins on the rail and come back later to see them flattened." She raised an eyebrow. She said, "That is dangerous." He nodded. He said, "We stopped." His voice softened. He said, "Some things you grow out of, some things you do not." The speaker finally called his train. He looked at the doors and then back at her. He said, "I should go." She said, "Of course." He took a step, then turned. He said, "I will be back." She felt the words settle inside her like a small stone in deep water. She said, "When?" He said, "I do not know yet." She said, "That is not a plan." He said, "It is a promise." He moved with the crowd but kept his face turned toward her until the last possible moment. She watched the doors close on a reflection of his eyes. The train pulled away. She stood very still, like movement might erase him. The platform returned to its ordinary rhythm. Someone laughed at a text. A stroller squeaked. The sky leaned toward evening. On the way home, she replayed every line they had traded, as if one might contain a map. She wrote his name on a fresh page and drew a thin box around it. She told herself not to expect anything. She told herself people say things in stations that they do not mean. Then she remembered the way he had said the word promise. It had sounded careful, like a glass he did not want to drop. Days passed. She came back to the same bench at the same hour. Sometimes she saw a boy in a jacket, and her heart jumped before she realized it was not him. Sometimes she told herself she would stop coming after today. She did not stop. She drew a small train at the bottom of each page and numbered the days like a quiet countdown. When autumn arrived, her mother noticed the routine and asked questions that Emily did not know how to answer. She said she liked the air at the station. She said the city felt honest there. She said she was writing. All of it was true, and none of it explained anything. At night she folded the notebook under her pillow and fell asleep with the soft weight of it near her hands. Winter came, and she kept the ritual. She learned the names of the attendants without asking. She learned which announcement voice belonged to which employee. She learned how the light changed on the rails when the hour turned. She learned how to wait without making a scene. Each lesson made the time quieter, not easier. She did not know it then, but that first meeting had already begun to shape her days. It had given her a measure to hold against time. It had given her a name to keep in the blank space of hope. It had given her a promise that she would not step away from. She told herself she was not waiting for a miracle. She told herself she was waiting for a person who had said he would come back. By the time the first snow fell, her waiting had become as much a part of the station's rhythm as the trains themselves. At 4:15, she was there. Always the same bench, always the same notebook, always the same calm posture that seemed to belong to another time entirely. The platform crew no longer needed to glance around to find her. They could sense she was in her place, the way you sense a clock ticking in a quiet room. People she had never spoken to began to feel they knew her in some strange way, because she was the one constant in the blur of rushing strangers. On a Wednesday afternoon, the cold was sharp enough to sting. Commuters huddled in coats, stomping their feet to keep warm. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the kiosk. Emily sat with her gloved hands wrapped around her notebook. She had started using thicker pens so the ink wouldn't freeze and skip on the page. She marked the date neatly in the top corner. Day 142. She didn't think of them as wasted days. Each one was another step toward the moment she believed was coming. And in a strange way, each day she waited made the promise stronger, not weaker. The train thundered in, metal on metal, a wave of heat rushing from its open doors. People poured out and more people pressed in, their boots clicking on the icy platform. Emily watched the faces without searching too obviously. She knew better than to let hope show in her eyes. Still, she couldn't help scanning for a familiar shape, a way of walking, a certain tilt of the head. When the train pulled away and the platform cleared, she remained, the cold wind tugging at the ends of her braid. She opened her notebook again and drew another small train at the bottom of the page, the lines quick but steady. The ritual was unshakable. At home that night, her mother tried again. "You were at the station," she said, though it wasn't a question. Emily nodded, pulling off her gloves. "Yes." "You've been going for months." "I like it there." Her mother frowned. "It's not healthy to hold on to something if you don't even know if it's—" She stopped herself, choosing her words more carefully. "People change, Emily." Emily met her mother's eyes. "I know. So do promises." The conversation ended there. They had both learned not to push too far. The days kept moving. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the city. The station smelled of wet wool and diesel. Emily's coat grew more worn at the elbows. She memorized the small details of winter at the platform, the way ice formed along the tracks in jagged lines, the way the announcement speaker sometimes crackled just before the voice came through, the way the light dimmed early and made the station lamps look warmer than they were. Some commuters began to nod to her in passing. A tall man with a briefcase would tip his head slightly when he stepped off the train. A young woman in a red hat would smile faintly as she passed. Emily never waved back, but she acknowledged them with her eyes. One afternoon, she arrived early and sat watching the empty rails. A boy selling newspapers stopped in front of her. "You're waiting for someone," he said confidently. She looked up from her notebook. "Yes." "Are they coming today?" "I don't know." The boy studied her face, as if trying to decide whether she was serious. Then he shrugged and moved on, calling out headlines to the next group of commuters. Emily let the silence settle around her again. She wasn't counting on today. She never counted on any particular day. But she counted all of them just the same. When the 4:20 came and went, she closed her notebook and sat still for another full minute, watching the horizon where the tracks curved out of sight. Then she stood, her boots crunching softly in the snow, and left without looking back. The next day, she was there again. Day 143. The number didn't scare her. If anything, it reassured her. Each page in her notebook was proof that she hadn't given up, proof that the moment she was waiting for would mean something when it finally came. It was late February when someone finally broke the invisible wall she had built around herself. The wind that day was restless, sweeping dust and scraps of paper down the platform, rattling the metal sign above the bench. Emily sat where she always sat, her notebook balanced on her knees, gloved fingers steady as she wrote. The 4:15 announcement echoed overhead, and the crowd began to thicken. Among them was a man in his early 30s with a worn satchel slung across his shoulder. His name was Jack, though she didn't know it yet. He had noticed her weeks ago. How could he not? She was the only fixed point in the blur of arriving and departing faces. He had watched her from a distance, wondering if her story was the kind you asked about, or the kind you left alone. That afternoon, he decided to ask. He stopped in front of her bench, shifting his satchel slightly. "You're here every day." Emily didn't look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, closed her notebook, and glanced at him. "I am." "You waiting for a train?" Her answer was simple. "Not exactly." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly. Seems like you're here more than some of the staff." She gave the faintest smile. "Maybe I am." The train pulled in, brakes screeching against steel. People surged forward, the cold air replaced briefly by the warmer scent of the carriages. Jack didn't move. "If you're not catching the train, what keeps you here?" Emily's eyes shifted to the doors as they opened, scanning without moving her head. "A promise." He studied her for a moment. "Promises can take a long time to keep." "I know," she said. The crowd thinned as passengers boarded. Jack finally stepped toward the train, pausing once more. "Just be careful you're not waiting so long you miss the rest of your life." Emily didn't answer, and he didn't expect her to. The doors closed, the whistle blew, and the train carried him away. That brief exchange didn't go unnoticed. The ticket attendant, who had been leaning on the counter, watched the interaction closely. Later, he mentioned it to one of the kiosk vendors. "That guy talked to her today. First time I've seen anyone do more than nod." The vendor shook his head. "She's not going to tell a stranger her whole life story." "Maybe not," the attendant said, "but maybe she's not as closed off as she looks." The next day, Jack was back, stepping off the train with the other evening arrivals. He spotted her on the bench again and gave a quick nod. She returned it without hesitation. It became a small ritual between them, nothing more than a glance or a greeting, but enough to mark the days. After a week of this, Jack tried again. "You know," he said, standing near her bench, "if you're going to keep waiting here, you might as well have some company." Emily looked up. Company can make waiting harder. Or easier, Jack said. Depends on the person. She considered that for a moment, then went back to her notebook. It's not personal. This is something I have to do on my own. Jack didn't push. He wasn't the type to pry, but he kept the thought to himself that no one waits forever without a reason. Over the following weeks, their conversations stayed short. The weather began to soften, the first hints of spring pushing against the edges of winter. Emily noticed the way the light stayed a little longer in the evenings, how the metal of the rails no longer looked frozen solid. One Tuesday, Jack arrived later than usual. He said, "I thought I'd missed you." "You would have," she replied. "I don't stay after the train leaves." Jack smiled faintly. "You have rules for your waiting." "Not rules," Emily said. "Boundaries." The train arrived then, pulling both of their attention toward the platform edge. As always, she searched the faces. As always, the one she wanted wasn't there. When the crowd dispersed, Jack gave a small wave and left. Emily opened her notebook again, adding another train sketch at the bottom of the page. Day 168. The number was climbing, and so was the quiet certainty inside her that she would keep going, no matter how many conversations tried to pull her away from the bench. At the back of her desk drawer, beneath a stack of loose notes and old ticket stubs, there was an envelope she had never mailed. The paper inside had softened with age, the folds worn thin from being opened and refolded too many times. It was addressed to a name she had never stopped saying in her mind: Daniel. She had written it almost a year after that first meeting at the station. At the time, she had convinced herself that if she just put the right words on paper, he would somehow feel them across the distance. She didn't have his address, but that hadn't mattered when she started writing. What mattered was saying the things she couldn't say to anyone else. That night, after another cold day at the station, Emily sat at her desk and unfolded the letter again. The handwriting was slightly uneven, the ink faded at the edges. She began to read. Daniel, you probably don't remember me the way I remember you. We only talked for a short time, but it felt different. I've met a lot of people in passing, but you stayed. Not physically. You left on your train. But something stayed behind. It made me start looking at the clock every afternoon, thinking maybe this was the day you'd be there again. You said you'd be back. You didn't say when. I told myself not to count the days, but I do anyway. I try to imagine what you've been doing all this time, if you've changed, if you still smile the same way. I wonder if you remember the smell of cut grass from that day, or how the air felt before the rain started. I wonder if you ever think about the station at all. I'm still here. The letter ended there, as if she'd run out of words before she could decide what she was asking of him. She folded it back along the same creases, slid it into the envelope, and placed it on the desk. She had never shown it to anyone. Not to her mother, not to Jack, not even to herself in the mirror when she thought about saying the words out loud. It wasn't that she was ashamed. It was that putting the letter in the mail felt like a risk she wasn't ready to take. If she sent it, and he didn't answer, the quiet thread that connected her to him would snap. As long as the letter stayed in her drawer, unopened by anyone but her, the possibility remained. That week, she kept thinking about the letter every time she sat at the station. The trains came and went, the platform filled and emptied, and she would imagine a version of herself walking up to a man stepping off the train, pressing the envelope into his hands before she could lose her courage. One evening, Jack caught her staring at nothing in particular. "You look like you're somewhere else," he said. "Maybe I am," she replied. "Thinking about the person you're waiting for?" Emily glanced at him but didn't answer. He held up his hand slightly. "All right, No questions. After he left, she opened her notebook, and, instead of drawing her usual small train, she sketched the outline of an envelope. She shaded it carefully until it looked real enough to lift from the page. It was her way of acknowledging that the letter was part of her waiting, even if it never left her desk. At home, she opened the drawer and looked at it again. The edges were beginning to curl, and a faint crease had appeared on the envelope's flap. She smoothed it out with her fingertips. For a moment, she imagined sealing it, writing an address, and walking to the nearest mailbox. She even pictured the sound it would make falling inside. But she didn't move. She slid the envelope back under the stack of papers, closed the drawer, and sat on the edge of her bed. Some promises, she thought, don't need reminders. They just need time. The next day, she was back at the station. Day 192. The letter stayed where it had always been, unmailed, but not forgotten. That Thursday afternoon began like all the others. The sky was the color of dull steel, low clouds pressing over the city. Emily arrived at the station a few minutes early, her boots clicking on the pavement as she crossed to her bench. The air smelled faintly of rain, though none had fallen yet. She settled in, opened her notebook, and began marking the date in her careful handwriting. Day 227. The 4:15 announcement hummed over the loudspeaker. People gathered in the usual clusters, their conversations overlapping in a low hum. Somewhere down the platform, the coffee vendor called out an order. Emily kept her eyes on the blank space beneath the date, waiting for the moment when the distant vibration of the tracks told her the train was near. She had stopped expecting him on any particular day. The hope was still there, but it had reshaped itself into something quieter, less sharp. She told herself she would wait as long as it took. But when she heard the first distant horn, her heart still reacted the same way, tightening, just a little. The train appeared from around the curve, its headlights cutting through the pale light. Emily closed her notebook and set it on her lap. The brakes screeched, the cars shuddered to a stop, and the doors slid open. The crowd surged forward. She watched faces pass, strangers with briefcases, women balancing shopping bags, a boy with headphones, a man in a uniform. Her gaze moved automatically, searching, scanning, and then stopping. He was there. Daniel stepped onto the platform with the easy stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. His hair was a little shorter than she remembered, his jaw a little sharper. But his eyes, she knew them instantly. They swept the platform as if looking for something or someone. Emily froze. For a second she thought she was imagining him, her mind playing a trick after so many months. But then he spotted her. The moment his gaze locked on hers, the noise of the platform seemed to drop away. He walked toward her, weaving through the thinning crowd. She didn't move. She wasn't sure she could. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her notebook until her knuckles ached. When he reached her bench, he stopped just short of sitting. Emily. Her name sounded different in his voice now. Older, heavier, like it had been carried across years. She found her voice, though it came out soft. You came back. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. I said I would. For a moment, neither of them moved. She searched his face for answers to questions she'd been holding for so long. There were lines at the corners of his eyes now, and a tiredness in the way he carried himself. The last of the passengers left the platform. The next announcement echoed distantly. I wasn't sure you'd still be here, Daniel said. I wasn't sure either, Emily admitted, but I couldn't not come. He sat down beside her, the bench creaking slightly under their weight. A lot happened, more than I can explain in a few seconds, but I never forgot this place. Or you. She turned toward him fully. Why now? Daniel looked down at his hands. Because I finally could. And because I didn't want to spend another year wondering if you'd still be here. Rain began to fall lightly, speckling the platform. Neither of them moved to leave. Emily's notebook lay between them, closed. She rested her hand on it without thinking. I've been marking the days, she said. I figured you might, he said with a faint smile. You always seemed like the type to keep count. She studied him for another long moment, part of her still afraid he might vanish with the next train. But he stayed, his shoulder warm beside hers in the damp air. The loudspeaker announced the arrival of another train, but they didn't get up. Emily realized she was no longer watching the doors for him. He was already here. They sat there for a while, the sound of rain filling the space between their words. Daniel's hands were clasped loosely, his eyes on the wet tracks. Emily kept her notebook closed on her lap, unsure if she wanted to write anything yet. After all this time, she wasn't ready to reduce the moment to ink and paper. Daniel finally spoke. I thought about this place more times than I can count. I kept seeing it in my head. The platform, the bench, you. Emily looked at him. What stopped you from coming sooner? He exhaled slowly. Life. Bad timing. Some things I could have handled better. Some things I couldn't control. My dad got sick not long after we met. I left for work overseas for a while. Then one delay turned into another, and it felt like the right time to come back kept getting further away. Emily asked, And you never forgot? Never, he said. I didn't know if you would still be here. I told myself it was possible you had moved on, or that you would think I was foolish for showing up after so long. She shook her head slightly. I didn't move on. He glanced at her notebook. That what you've been writing all this time? Not all of it, she said, but a lot. He gave a small smile. I imagined 1,000 different ways this might happen. Most of them ended with you walking away. Emily's voice was steady. You said you'd come back. Daniel nodded. And I meant it. The rain grew heavier, bouncing off the platform roof. A small group of passengers hurried past to catch the next train, their umbrellas shaking droplets onto the ground. The smell of wet metal and diesel hung in the air. Emily asked, Why today? Because I finally ran out of excuses, Daniel said. And I didn't want to wonder anymore. I didn't want to keep replaying that day and wishing I'd done more. She thought of the letter in her desk drawer, the one she had never sent. For a moment she imagined handing it to him now, letting him read the words she had written when the promise was still new. But she didn't. Instead she asked, Did you think I'd be angry? I hoped you wouldn't, he said, but I would have understood if you were. They both watched as another train pulled in, the windows glowing against the gray afternoon. Neither of them moved to leave. Emily said quietly, I almost stopped coming. More than once. But something kept me here. Daniel's eyes softened. I'm glad it did. The minutes passed without hurry. They talked about small things, how the station had changed, how the coffee vendor still burned the milk, how the announcements were louder than they used to be. It was as if they were building a bridge back from the years apart, plank by plank. Eventually, Daniel asked, So what happens now? Emily looked out at the rain. I don't know, he said. Maybe we figure it out somewhere that's not this bench. She glanced at him, measuring the truth of his presence, the weight of him sitting beside her after all the days she had counted. For the first time in months, she closed her notebook without drawing the small train at the bottom of the page. Daniel noticed. No sketch today. No, she said. I think I've marked enough. They stood together, the bench now empty for the first time since she had claimed it. As they walked toward the station exit, she realized the waiting was over, but the story wasn't. Not yet. Not even close. The next morning, Emily woke to the unfamiliar sensation of not needing to be anywhere at 4:15. For months, that time had been carved into her day as sharply as the hour she woke or the moment she turned off her bedside lamp. But now, the ritual was gone, replaced by the quiet knowledge that Daniel was no longer somewhere far away. He was here. She made coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, the notebook resting beside her cup. The cover was worn, the pages full, each one holding a record of her waiting. She traced a finger over the earliest dates, remembering how the sketches had started out neat and deliberate, then grew faster and looser as the days stacked up. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed. A short message. "Meet me at the station? One last time." She smiled at the screen. At 3:30, she left her apartment and walked the familiar route. The air was warmer than it had been in months, carrying the faint smell of thawing earth. She crossed the street, past the kiosk where the vendor was restocking shelves, and stepped onto the platform. Daniel was already there, leaning against the railing, his hands in his pockets. He straightened when he saw her. "Didn't want to make you come here alone today," he said. Emily looked at the bench where she had sat for so long. "Feels strange seeing it like this." He followed her gaze. "Strange how?" "Like it's not mine anymore. Like it's just a bench again." Daniel nodded. "Maybe that's a good thing." They stood side by side, watching as the 4:20 rolled in. The same screech of brakes, the same hiss of the doors opening, the same rush of passengers. But Emily didn't scan the faces this time. She just listened to the hum of the station, letting it settle into something new in her mind. When the train pulled away, Daniel turned to her. "Walk with me?" They left the platform together, their steps falling into rhythm. She realized how different it felt to leave this place not in silence, but with someone beside her. They passed the ticket booth, and the older attendant gave a small nod, less curious now, more like a quiet acknowledgement that the story everyone had wondered about had finally reached a turning point. As they moved through the streets, Daniel told her about the years between that summer afternoon and now. The jobs, the moves, the moments he had thought about turning back but didn't. The way the memory of her had stayed sharp when everything else blurred. Emily listened without interrupting, storing each detail like she had once stored the sketches in her notebook. When he finished, she said simply, "I'm glad you found your way." They reached a small park where the trees were still bare, their branches tangled against the pale sky. Daniel stopped near a bench, not her bench, not the station's bench, just a bench. "I don't know what's next," he admitted, "but I'd like to figure it out with you." Emily sat, resting her notebook on her lap. For the first time in months, she opened to a blank page without writing the date at the top. She drew nothing. No train, no station, just a line across the middle of the page, as if marking the point where one chapter ended and another began. Daniel watched her. "No drawing?" She shook her head. "Not today." They stayed in the park until the light began to fade, talking about ordinary things, meals, books, places they might visit. And when they finally stood to leave, Emily didn't look back toward the station. She didn't need to. The waiting was over. The promise had been kept. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready for what came next. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.